What is unlearning? Is unlearning a necessary consequence of learning? What do I unlearn when I unlearn? In deciding who I am, have I considered who I have decided not to be? Where is justice in this? Shouldn't the people who talked up the things I now am have told me about the things I can no longer be? Was there ever even a question? This is a presentation of two definitions of unlearning and their ethical implications for education. So the first definition is more difficult to explain and sort of more important. I'm calling it the implicit negative side of learning. And by negative here I don't mean bad, I mean negative as in subtractive or something that takes away. So what I immediately want to explain that this isn't is something like the opportunity costs involved in a piece of learning. So when I say the negative side of learning, I don't mean, the extent to which, because I learned one thing, I had to use up that time and can't have learned something else. It means something more negative than that. I mean the distancing from X that happens when one learns Y. Or another way of putting it, if you're familiar with this piece of psychology, is the potentials for cognitive dissonance one builds in themselves by learning a given thing. And cognitive dissonance is, I guess, a widely empirically verified notion that some ideas don't inhabit the same mind well together. They kind of compete for the same space or seem to fight against each other. So I have some examples. The first is an example of this kind of unlearning that I think has to do with learning information. And it's this. So first you would learn that the military forces are sort of forces of national heroism and democracy. And this is something that I think would cause a kind of implicit negation, or it would later create a kind of cognitive dissonance if you were to learn that the military forces are a homicidal arm of a psychopathic political regime. The next example is, I think, maybe more interesting, and I think probably more important. It's an example of a kind of unlearning of not just a piece of information, but of a whole life world. And by life world, I mean this idea that we have not just ways of knowing the world, but ways of seeing it and kind of feeling it and living in it that exists, I guess, as a kind of knowledge that can be learned and unlearned. So the first point is that one would learn morality as a kind of rule following. So we can imagine what this would look like. A person growing up, and they're given this sense that one is moral insofar as one is following some kind of code of conduct. Okay, and this, I think, is an implicit unlearning of the sense that morality is essentially some kind of question of how authentic or caring one is, or some question of whether one has the right for a kind of disposition in their life. So I hope it's clear how this is working. Like, to the extent that one learned A, or I guess it could be the other way around. To the extent that one learned A or B, I think one would be sort of implicitly unlearning the opposing statement. That is, they would be making it harder for themselves to learn the opposite of whichever one they learned. Okay, so now I want to offer another definition of another type of unlearning. Call it Unlearning 2. So this is, I guess, the more straightforward kind of unlearning, the kind of unlearning you might first think of when someone says the word. It's learning done with a negative goal. So this means like purposefully eliminating a belief you might have, or a piece of information, or purposefully distancing yourself from a kind of way of being in the world. So I have some examples of this one too. So the first is also a kind of unlearning of information. So this would be purposefully eliminating your sense that eating store discarded comestibles are going to make you sick. So whatever you would have to do to purposefully eliminate that knowledge, that would be a kind of unlearning in this sense. The other, again, is I think more important and interesting, is the way you would apply this kind of unlearning to not just information, but to your life world. And so the example is purposefully moving out into the countryside in order to learn to to stop thinking about time in the way you had in the city. So you want to unlearn not just a piece of information, but a whole experience of time. Okay, so I have two additional claims that I want to make, which I think relate the idea of unlearning more explicitly to education. The first is that I don't think educational institutions are very honest about the fact that unlearning in the first sense happens. They don't seem to take much time to talk to students about the fact that it might be happening, and they certainly don't go the extra step of helping students to negotiate this kind of unlearning as a real cost of their learning a given thing. So they, for example, I don't think you would ever, in a sort of normal school, sit down and say, like, look, if you learn this one thing, then that's going to make it more difficult for you to learn this other thing. Or if you develop this way of being in the world, it's going to be more difficult to be in the world in this other kind of way. The other claim is that I don't think educational institutions, they don't provide opportunities to do purposeful unlearning. I can't imagine that happening outside of like a very alternative school that's sort of designed around the idea of deschooling or unlearning or something like that. And I guess it sort of makes sense that they wouldn't do this, because, I mean, if they can't sort of see the extent to which unlearning in the first sense is happening, they wouldn't see any reason to provide opportunities to unlearn any of the sort of things that students had learned in the first place. And finally, I have an extreme or kind of radical claim, which I guess isn't a claim that you should have to agree with in order to find the ideas of unlearning sort of interesting and important, but maybe for some people is an idea that can help them understand why it might be an extremely important idea. And this is just the claim that for most people, most elements of a really excellent life world, so the elements that would make up a really sort of excellent way of being in the world, these are elements that are systematically unlearned in schools and elsewhere. And this unlearning is rarely going to be unlearned in the second sense of that word over the course of their lives. So, just to say that in another way, what I'm saying is most of the ways in which it will be really excellent for people to live are ways that the learning people do is going to make it difficult to learn. And then after it's become difficult for people to learn these excellent ways to live, they're rarely going to be given chances to unlearn that learning. And then I just have a list of what these elements of an excellent life world are, at least in my sense of what they are. So I have the ability to wait with pleasure, desires for mutual recognition of pleasure, desires to engage in participatory democracy, desires to live in really mutually dependent community, desires to share possessions freely, a basic trust and openness to others, the experience of gratification as something that's delayable, an understanding of maladaptive behavior as evidencing a need for help rather than vengeance or retribution, an understanding of art as therapeutic, expressive, utilitarian craft, confidence in one's own ability, or at least potential ability, to produce and repair rather than purchase basic goods like food, clothing, housing, transportation, etc. And finally, an ability to hold core beliefs in a really fallibilistic way. So, I hope it's clear. I'm just saying that I think for most people, the things that are learned, in school, at home, at work, are going to be things that are going to make it very hard for any of these things to really be a part of their life world. And they're probably not, I think for most people, going to be given a chance to ever unlearn those things that are going to make it very difficult for them to incorporate these things into their own life world. Finally, I just have some discussion questions, although obviously you should feel free to discuss any questions that seem relevant. But the ones that I did prepare are, what, if any, responsibility do educational institutions have to alert students to the likelihood of unlearning in the first sense resulting from the learning they will be compelled to do? Next, what, if any, responsibility do educational institutions have to present students with opportunities to consider or perform unlearning in the second sense? What are things we've unlearned in the first sense that we wish we hadn't? And what are things we'd like to unlearn in the second sense?